No one in our town knew what lay beyond the massive mountain that loomed to the west. Only rumors and legends surrounded it. Some spoke of an abandoned village inhabited by the souls of the dead, while others insisted that untold treasures were hidden there. However, no one ever returned to confirm these stories. My interest in these places was kindled in childhood when my father told me scary stories by the fireplace, but it wasn't until years later that I decided to venture there. My name is Alexei. I've always been curious and couldn't stay away from something mysterious. This time I felt I had to unravel the mountain's mystery and discover what lay beyond its peak. They said those who crossed the mountain never returned, but that didn't stop me. Preparation took several months. I gathered maps, reread old legends, and searched for records of those who tried to cross the mountain, but all to no avail. The only map I could find was so ancient and worn that half the inscriptions on it were illegible. However, it was my only lead. I equipped myself with everything I might need for a long journey: food, warm clothing, a tent, tools, and weapons. Though I didn't know what awaited me, my intuition told me that danger lurked at every step. The night before setting off, I visited my old friend Victor. He was the only one who knew of my intentions. We talked for a long time, and he warned me against the journey, but I was resolute. As a farewell, Victor gave me an amulet, which he said would protect me from evil spirits. Early in the morning, I left town and headed toward the mountain. The day was warm and clear, but as I approached the foothills, the sky began to cloud over. The sense of unease grew with each step. Finally, I reached the point where the ascent began. The mountain seemed endless, its peak lost in thick mist. The path was difficult. The rocky trail led me ever higher, and soon I could no longer tell where I was. The wind picked up, and I felt the cold penetrate my clothing. The trail became increasingly winding, and I began to doubt my decision, but it was too late to turn back. When I reached the mountain's peak, a strong wind nearly knocked me off my feet. I stopped to catch my breath and suddenly felt a presence. Looking around, I saw no one, but the feeling didn't go away. At that moment, I noticed strange symbols on the stones around me. They resembled ancient runes, but I couldn't decipher them. My attention was drawn to a narrow path leading down the other side of the mountain. I decided to follow it. As I descended, the mist grew thicker, and I began to lose my sense of direction. After a while, I heard the sound of a bell ringing from deep within the forest. I followed the sound, thinking it would lead me to people. The forest was dark and foreboding, with trees standing close together, their branches intertwining to form strange shapes. I walked for a long time until I noticed a faint light ahead. As I got closer, I saw a small village nestled in the dense forest. It looked abandoned. The roofs of the houses were sagging, windows were broken, and there wasn't a soul on the streets. I entered the village and headed for the largest house. The door was ajar, and I cautiously stepped inside. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. The furniture was in place, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. In the corner of the room, I noticed an old chest that caught my attention. Opening it, I found an ancient book filled with strange symbols. The more I read, the more I realized I had stumbled upon a place that shouldn't exist. The book described rituals and spells designed to summon spirits and demons. I grew increasingly uneasy, but I couldn't stop. I read about an ancient cult that used the mountain's power to open gates to another dimension. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. Turning around, I saw a shadow flit past the window. I rushed to the door, but before I could exit, a chilling cold enveloped me. The air filled with strange sounds, as if there were many invisible beings around me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey, and I fell to the floor. When I came to, it was already evening. The sun was setting, and the shadows were growing longer. I gathered my strength and left the house. The village seemed even more eerie. I felt that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I saw a figure in the distance, moving toward me. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I looked closer, I realized it was something else. It was a creature with human-like features, but its eyes glowed bright red, and its skin was pale, almost dead-like. It moved smoothly as if it didn't touch the ground. I understood that I had to run, but where? I ran back into the forest, but the mist thickened with each passing second, and I lost the path. Figures began to appear around me, more and more of them. I didn't understand how they could be here, but they surrounded me. These were the village inhabitants, but they were no longer alive. I noticed that the village had disappeared, and I was in an endless forest. The figures slowly closed in, whispering something in an unknown language. I felt something pulling me down, and I realized I was getting closer to the gates I had read about in the book. Finally, I reached a clearing where the trees parted, revealing the entrance to a cave. I understood that this was the gate described in the book. Inside the cave, it was cold and damp, and the walls were covered in the same symbols as in the book. I felt that this place was a point of no return. When I entered the cave, the air grew heavy, and I began to suffocate. Suddenly, I saw an altar in the center of the cave with an old book lying on it. I approached and opened it. At that moment, I heard a whisper emanating from the book. It seemed to be alive. The whisper grew louder, and I felt something invisible wrapping around me. Suddenly, the cave began to shake, and I realized that the gate was starting to open. At that moment, it became clear to me that this was not just a place of power but a portal to another world, full of horror and darkness. I tried to close the book, but I couldn't. The whisper turned into a loud scream, and the shadows surrounding me began to merge into one. I saw creatures emerging from the opening gates that didn't belong to our world. Their eyes glowed brightly. They were full of hatred and malice. I realized that if I didn't stop this, the world would perish. I gathered all my strength and, despite my fear, began to recite a spell I had found in the book. At that moment, the cave shook even more violently, and I felt something pulling me down. But I continued to recite, and soon the shadows began to retreat. Finally, the gates began to close. The creatures tried to break through, but I felt the book's power growing stronger. I closed the book, and at that moment, the cave exploded with light. I found myself on the ground, surrounded by emptiness. When I awoke, it was already daylight. I was lying at the foot of the mountain, and next to me lay the very book. I realized that I had managed to stop the catastrophe, but at what cost? I gathered my things and headed back to town, but I knew that the world would never be the same. Since then, I have never returned to the mountain and have told no one what happened. But I know that those who seek answers will find them, and this story will repeat itself again.